Hi again, and welcome to our week on stress and well-being. To give you an idea again of where we are in the course, we're still talking about these individual processes that lead to our critical outcomes of job attitudes and job behaviors. And this week, we're going to center in on stress and well-being or stress and health. There are lots of different ways that we can frame this. And personally, I would argue that this should actually be one of the key outcomes that we care about. So, alongside job attitudes and job behaviors, I would say we should care about stress and well being because we should care about whether our employees are happy and if they're thriving and if they're healthy at work. But of course, I can't sort of change the way the field thinks. So we're going to treat this as an individual process that is very tightly connected to how we feel at work and how we behave at work. So to give you an idea of what we're going to talk about throughout our time this week, we're going to start off by defining stress, and we're going to differentiate between good stress and bad stress. I know the idea of good stress might be a little strange or counterintuitive, but we know that stress can be helpful in some ways. So we're going to define what good stress looks like and talk about when that can happen. Then we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about just a small number of theories of stress and how we explain the impact of stress. Here, it is not going to be like the motivation chapter. I know that we are maybe a little theoried out, but we're just going to talk about some high-level tenets of just a handful of theories, really just 3 theories here, so that we can understand how we should think about stress and how we can design workplaces that are not fully stress-free, but at least mitigate stress. Then we're going to talk about the consequences of stress at work, or what happens when we experience stress. We'll talk about some different stressors or some different ways that we can be stressed out. And then I think most importantly, we're going to end by examining some ways that we can reduce stress. And we'll talk about some very specific interventions that either individual employees or organizations can use to lower stress. So getting started and jumping right in here, I want to first define exactly what stress is. I think we all implicitly know when we're experiencing stress, but it's actually a surprisingly difficult construct to define. So here I'm going to use the definition from the book, and your book defines it as the body's reaction to a change that requires a physical, mental, or emotional adjustment or response. In other words, that means that stress is something that we feel in response to a threat. It's a physiological response that comes from an evolutionarily old part of our brain. And basically, we're wired to detect threats in our environment and then to respond in a way that allows us to successfully overcome that threat. You can imagine how beneficial it was for our far removed ancestors to be able to detect threats like a large animal in amongst the trees and then react in a way that allows them to evade the animal and not get eaten. That's essentially where our stress response comes from. And I'm sure everyone is familiar with experiencing that fight or flight response when we detect a threat or a potential threat in our environment. Then one other important thing to keep in mind when defining stress is also that stress is dependent on our perceptions of the threat. That means that it's possible that one person would find a particular stimulus threatening, whereas another person wouldn't, and we wouldn't expect those 2 people to have the same physiological reaction. We also know that a threat can be more stressful when we're already dealing with some other threats, right? If we have many threats in our environment. So we have to remember that the impact that different stressors or threats will have on us isn't necessarily the same across people, or even across time or situations within the same person. All right, so now I want to dig into this idea that not all stress is bad, right? And what I've just told you on the previous slide is that stress is ultimately an adaptive response. It allows us to respond to threatening external stimuli in an appropriate way. And in many ways, whether stress is good or bad, adaptive or maladaptive, is dependent on how much stress we're experiencing. And I want to sort of represent that here visually. So what I have here is what we call the Yerkes-Dodson curve, which demonstrates that stress can be a positive thing for our responses, or that it can actually lead to positive outcomes if we're experiencing the right amount of threat. Now here, if we're looking at this graph, the x-axis is arousal and the y-axis is performance. So what we know is that experiencing stress increases our arousal, and we'll talk about that process in a minute. And we also know that some degree of arousal is actually a good thing for performance. It increases our attention, it increases our interest, and it provides us with the energy that's needed to actually perform tasks. So as arousal increases, so does performance, at least at first. Then we hit our peak, and this is called our optimal level of arousal, which also corresponds to our optimal level of performance. But as we talked about with motivation, everyone sort of has a different optimal level of arousal, right? So this looks a little bit different for everybody. But what's true across all people is that if we keep adding stress past this point, past this optimum level, that's when we become too aroused or we experience too much stress. And that's when stress becomes negative for performance. And we can differentiate the first part of this graph from where we're at the low end to hitting our peak as eustress, as positive stress that's good for performance. And then everything after hitting our optimum arousal to the end, right, to the high end of this chart, as distress or negative stress. And this is where, again, we're going to see that impairment in performance. And this is where it can actually cause anxiety, right? Because we're too stressed out. Now, what I want you to take away from this is that stress can be functional and it can even be positive for our performance. So you don't necessarily want to reduce every single stressor in the workplace. If we have a workplace where nobody feels particularly aroused by anything, then there's no motivation, right? There's no piece that's sort of getting us to do something and engaging in tasks. However, with that in mind, we need to make sure that stress levels remain manageable and that we don't push people into this zone, right, past our optimal arousal. When we do, it's bad for their performance, but that's also when it starts to take a big toll on health and well-being as well. And that's, again, going to be the focus of our lecture today. So I also wanted to answer the question up front of why we should care about stress and well-being. Why am I spending an entire week of this course talking about this? And why do I personally feel like this actually belongs on the far side of that chart that I keep showing you throughout the semester as one of the core outcomes that we should care about in OB and HR? And really the answer is that because stress is incredibly harmful for employees and also incredibly costly for organizations. If we start off by thinking about employees, an overwhelming majority of employees report that work stress or burnout is their greatest challenge at work, right? Over 80% of employees say that that's their greatest challenge. Then we also know that work stress contributes to 120,000 excess deaths per year. And what that means is that people are dying sooner than they should simply because they're experiencing so much stress at work. And unfortunately, that means that work stress is actually one of the leading causes or contributors of death or to death in the United States. Then if we think about this from the organization's perspective, we also see a pretty significant bill associated with work stress. And this comes in the form of increased healthcare costs due to employees experiencing ailments that arise from chronic stress. It can also be due to things like lost productivity, turnover, all of that. And what we see is that if we just think about that one piece, that annual healthcare expenditure piece, that costs organizations $190 billion a year. And that's before we even factor in any of those other costs that I just mentioned. So hopefully all of this together demonstrates that we should take stress very seriously and work to understand and reduce stress wherever we can. So today we're going to talk about a lot of different things that can cause stress. We're going to talk about specific stressors. We're going to talk about the consequences of those stressors. But I first want to talk about a general model that categorizes our reactions to stressors. And this model, or it's really a progression, is called the General Adaptation Syndrome. And it was proposed that this process happens in response to all types of stressors. So it doesn't matter what kind of stressor you're experiencing, whether that's a work-related stressor or not. It could be an injury, a chronic illness, some form of trauma. It could be psychological stress. It doesn't matter. What this model would say is that we experience the same unfolding process or the same sort of progression of stages regardless of the specific stressor. Now, to dig in a little bit deeper, this model says that there are 3 stages of reacting to a stressor. The first stage is what we call the alarm reaction stage, and this is where our body physiologically responds to the presence of stress. We can think of this as our fight or flight response. Our body reacts by doing things like increasing our heart rate. We're going to release stress hormones. That includes adrenaline, noradrenaline, epinephrine, cortisol, those sorts of things. Our palms are going to get sweaty, right? We're all probably very aware of what this feels like. Then we have our second stage, which is our resistance stage. During this stage, we're focused on coping with the original stressor. Coping is generally a good thing, but that means that our efforts are devoted to one stressor, and that unfortunately lowers our resistance to other stressors. So during this time, when we're mobilizing all of our effort to coping with our initial stressor, if we have another stressor that occurs during this period, then we're going to have fewer resources available to cope with that second stressor and might ultimately have a stronger reaction to it. Then the third and final stage is what we call the exhaustion stage. Here we have all of these physiological reactions. Those are going to be sustained when we're talking about chronic stress. Then our resistance to additional stressors is lowered, right? We are in the state of physiological exhaustion. We've mobilized all of our resources to coping, and that means that our resources are extremely taxed during this time. And eventually that compounds, and our resistance for all stressors are going to drop. During this stage, this exhaustion stage, we see people develop more severe consequences associated with exposure to chronic stress. So this is where we'll see things like burnout develop and some more severe mental and physical health problems. Now, as you probably noticed in how I talked about this is a model of chronic stress. So here we're talking about reactions that are expected when we have repeated exposure to stressors and not just sort of a one-off stressful experience, right? So these things have to sustain over time. And if we think about these different reactions, we can see again how this can be so impactful, right? And how when we think about chronic stress, organizations need to take this very seriously and need to intervene so employees don't hit this exhaustion stage where they are experiencing burnout and developing mental and physical health conditions. So we're going to focus most of our lecture today on these repeated stressors or on the experience of chronic stress because that is so damaging for employees. So as we talk about these different stressors and we talk about these different consequences, let's keep this general adaptation syndrome in mind because these are the underlying processes that we assume are happening across all of these stressors and that are going to lead to the development of the different consequences we're going to talk about. All right, so now we're going to get into talking about specific stressors, and we're going to categorize these different stressors and sort of think about where they develop. All right, so the first category of stressors that we're going to talk about is what we call physical stressors, and exactly as the name suggests, physical stressors refer to things in the environment that cause stress. And really early research in OB and HR was really focused in on the physical environment and thinking about ways that our physical environment can cause us stress. One of the most studied physical stressors across all of time is noise. Unsurprisingly, working in a noisy environment is very stressful, and that's particularly true when the noise is unpredictable and uncontrollable. Exposure to noisy environments has also been found to decrease performance and decrease motivation. So I also want to sort of draw attention that noisy environments are not necessarily what we think of. So we may think of noisy environments as something like a construction site, a factory, something that has, a lot of very loud noises. But research shows that this applies even to just an average open office, right? Even when we just have these sort of open spaces that don't have a lot of walls and a lot of segmentation, we can see that the noise levels just from hearing our coworkers on the phone or hearing them type or those sorts of things can be equally stressful and equally harmful for performance and motivation. And this is something to keep in mind because a lot of recent redesign for workplaces has focused on this open office plan, and research shows that that might not be the best approach. Then some other physical stressors include things like exposure to extreme temperatures. People are often interested in exposure to heat in particular, and what we see is that working outside in hot climates or working with things like welding equipment, which are very hot, expose workers to extreme heat, and that type of exposure creates very high levels of stress and can result in a lot of physical ailment as well. Then we also have a lot of work on things like lighting conditions. If lights are too bright or lights are too dim, that can cause a lot of stress and actually damage your vision if things are too extreme in either direction. Then we also have what we call task stressors, and this is really sort of about what you do at work or what you're being asked to do. And I'm sure none of these are surprising. We see that having high workload, meaning that your work is very demanding and you're expected to accomplish a lot in a given shift, is associated with stress and several physical symptoms, including upper body and lower back disorders. And then we also have work hours as a task stressor, and this has very similar consequences to workload. So if we expect employees to work a lot of hours, that increases stress and also creates physical ailments. And in fact, most research shows that working any more than 45 hours per week really increases these outcomes. So that might argue that the cost of asking your employees to work more hours doesn't really outweigh the benefits here. Then the next few stressors that we're going to talk about are classified as psychological stressors. So these aren't characteristics of the physical environment or the work itself, like what we've just talked about, but these are things that are still psychologically harmful. So one thing that we've already talked about throughout this semester that's a psychological stressor is emotional labor. We're not going to talk about that again here, but I did want to sort of tag back to some information that we've already shared. So our first psychological stressor or set of psychological stressors that we're going to talk about are what we call role stressors. Most jobs require you to fulfill multiple roles or serve in multiple different functions, and we know that stress can arise from having these competing demands. For example, one role that I have is being a researcher, one role that I have is being an instructor or a teacher, and then I also have a role as a mentor where I work closely with graduate students. Now, sometimes the roles that you have in the job aren't always clear, and sometimes they may even conflict with one another, or one role interferes with your ability to do the functions of another role. And that's really when role stress occurs. Now, we have 3 different types of role stressors, and I want to talk through what each of these are. Our first is role ambiguity, and I think this is the clearest of the 3 role stressors. Role ambiguity happens when employees aren't sure what their job function is, right? The job and the components of the job maybe haven't been so clearly defined, so there's some uncertainty about what tasks that employee is responsible for and what tasks the employee isn't responsible for. I'll use my job as an example, just because it's easy for me to do so because I have lots of knowledge about my job. So let's say I was told that I have to be a good instructor, but that's it. That would create a lot of ambiguity because I may not know what good means. Do I have to get certain teaching evaluations? What's the benchmark for good? Are there other ways that I'll be evaluated? So I wouldn't really know how to spend my time or exactly what behaviors are expected of me in that particular role. Then our other two, role conflict and role overload, are sometimes tricky to keep apart. So I want to make sure that we're teasing these apart early on. Role conflict happens when you have incompatible demands from different roles. If you've ever said something like, I have all of my final exams in a 2-day window, and all of my professors act like I only have their class to worry about, that's a great example of role conflict. The demands of your other classes are making it harder for you to meet the demands of this class, for example. Going back to my job, being a good researcher often conflicts with being a good teacher, because ideally you would devote all of your time to perfecting either one of them, but you can't do that because you have to divide your time between them. Then we have role overload, which again is sometimes tricky to keep separate from role conflict. But role overload is when you simply have too many roles to fulfill. Going back to my job, I have to publish lots of high quality papers. I have to get grant funding to do more research. I have to review articles for journals. I have to be entertaining in the classroom, keep up with all of the research both in my field and on being a good instructor, grade and respond to emails as quickly as possible, mentor graduate students, mentor undergraduate students, serve on committees, be the faculty advisor for a club here, present research at conferences, go to mandatory new faculty meetings, and so on and so on. This is a good example of role overload because I'm expected to fulfill a ton of different roles, and no one person has the time or resources to meet all of those different roles. So again, role conflict is I fulfill two distinct roles and they have competing demands. Role overload is I'm simply expected to do too much. Role conflict might be I serve on this particular committee and I also have this particular project, and they both scheduled a meeting for exactly the same time, and I can't be in two places at once. Role overload is they've asked me to take on 10 projects, and I simply don't have the time to do all of them, or at least do them well. So hopefully that helps distinguish role conflict from role overload. Then I also wanted to draw a little bit of attention to a specific type of role conflict that people can experience that we have not really paid a lot of attention to in OB and HR, and that's work-family conflict. So again, work-family conflict is a form of role conflict that hopefully makes role conflict a little bit more clear. And this happens when our work demands and our non-work demands are incompatible. So if I have a work meeting where I'm being asked to stay late, and I also have my kids' dance recital and they're at the exact same time, that's work-family conflict. I can't fulfill both of those obligations because they're competing. I can either go to the meeting or I can go to the dance recital, but I can't do both. And what we see is that work-family conflict is very common. This is a stressor that virtually all employees experience, both men and women alike. And it's particularly common in dual earning families, meaning both partners work outside of the home in terms of a formal employment. And work-family conflict can have really important consequences for employees. This is a form of stress. It can cause a lot of strain for one's health, and it also decreases performance, decreases satisfaction, and makes folks more likely to turn over and more likely to leave their jobs. But the good thing is there are some things that we can do that have been shown to decrease work-family conflict. And in particular, allowing telecommuting or allowing some form of remote work and having flexible work schedules appear to really reduce the extent to which people experience work-family conflict. All right, then our other psychological stressors tend to come from interpersonal sources. So we call these interpersonal stressors. And here we're talking about negative interactions between an employee and either a coworker, their supervisor or manager, or it could be an outsider. So something like a customer, a client, or a patient. And here we might call this interpersonal conflict, we might call this workplace mistreatment, but again, these happen in interpersonal interactions that might be one-on-one, and mistreatment or conflict can take lots of different forms. I think we often tend to think of really kind of egregious forms of mistreatment like violence or physical aggression, which are obviously really intense and can result in bodily injury, result in some of the most severe types of outcomes. But mistreatment can also be really subtle. And we call these more subtle behaviors incivility or microaggressions. Incivility can be something like refusing to make eye contact with someone repeatedly over time, constantly interrupting them when they speak, dismissing their opinions, excluding them from conversations, inviting everyone to lunch except for them, those kinds of things. And now what I want to sort of drive home here is that all of these are damaging. We sometimes think that physical violence or some sort of aggression where someone is yelling in our face, they're hot, they're intense, they're severe. So we think that those are going to be the kinds of behaviors that really harm employees. But what we see is that these subtle forms of mistreatment, the incivility, the microaggressions, can actually lead to more harmful outcomes and can actually be more stressful as compared to these kind of hot, in-your-face, blatant forms of mistreatment. And the reason why is because we have a tendency to kind of dismiss these minor incidents, so people may not take them that seriously, but they're also a lot harder to process, right? When we experience something that's subtle, it's a lot harder to sort of tell someone else what we've experienced and have them believe us. But it's also harder for us to sort of diagnose if somebody was intentionally being rude when they didn't make eye contact with us, for example, or when they spoke over us. And because we think about these events a lot more, we ruminate on them a lot more, they tend to have a larger cumulative impact. It's pretty easy to know what someone intended when they hit you or when they yell in your face. But when somebody shakes everybody's hand except for yours, you're kind of left wondering what happened. Was it intentional? Did I do something? Is it going to keep happening? And all of that is extremely draining. And just to, again, drive home this point, I wanted to talk through the findings from just one study to illustrate how costly these subtle behaviors can be, or how costly incivility in particular can be. And the study was an experiment. They had doctors working together in a simulated environment where they were trying to diagnose a patient and take appropriate treatment action. And in some conditions, they had someone be rude on the team. And in other cases, there was no incivility. Everybody just worked together politely. And what they found is just this small exposure to incivility in the medical team actually led to more diagnostic and therapeutic errors as compared to the other condition where there was no incivility. And some of those errors were actually so egregious that they could have led to fatal outcomes. So I think this is strong evidence that we shouldn't dismiss incivility just because it's seemingly minor, and that as HR professionals, we need to take that behavior very seriously. All right, so far we've talked about stressors as if they're kind of all bad, but that may not be the case, right? So in the same way that we differentiated between eustress and distress, I also want to differentiate between two types of stressors that might lead to distinct types of outcomes. And here I'm differentiating between what we call challenge stressors and hindrance stressors. Challenge stressors refer to stressors that offer some sort of potential gain. So getting more responsibility at work could be a good example of a challenge stressor. It may introduce stress because it means that we have increased demands and perhaps increased work hours, but it's also likely to be appraised positively because it offers that employee an individual or an opportunity to advance their careers. That's the potential gain here. Then hindrance stressors are stressors that don't offer any sort of potential gain. There's no opportunity for personal growth. And in fact, they tend to hold you back from career advancement or work achievement. So a hindrance stressor could be something like organizational politics. If an organization makes promotion decisions based on who they like the most instead of who's the best performer, then that would be stressful because it's holding you back from gaining what you want, right? Not an opportunity for personal growth. It's just keeping you from the outcomes that you care about. Then what's important here to take away is that challenge stressors and hindrance stressors have different outcomes. So both types of stressors lead to stress, right? They're both going to lead to that physiological arousal, those physiological symptoms that we talked about. But we actually see that challenge stressors are good for things like job satisfaction and performance. When we have these opportunities for growth, we're more satisfied and we perform better at work. Whereas hindrance stressors decrease satisfaction and decrease performance. They really just get in our way, and we find that when we have these hindrance stressors, they reduce satisfaction because they really are just barriers, right? They're just a nuisance. So here, we also need this nuance of not thinking about all stressors in the same way. All right, with all of that context and the introduction of lots of different types of stressors, physical stressors, task stressors, and psychological stressors, we're now going to talk about the outcomes of stress. And here we want to keep that general adaptation model in mind because that's the process that's happening, again, regardless of what specific stressor we're experiencing. And that's why we're going to experience these different outcomes that we're about to talk about. All right, so I always tell students that this is the day that I'm going to most sound like a psychologist and where my training in psychology is going to come through. But again, I am an occupational health psychologist. I care a lot about stress and well-being, and I care a lot about what happens to the body when we experience stress. The first set of outcomes that I want to talk about here corresponds to our most basic reaction that we have to stress that happens in that very first alarm reaction stage of the general adaptation syndrome, and this is the release of stress hormones. Now, all of these hormones are involved in different stress processes that we're going to talk about, but they ultimately lead to these behavioral and health outcomes that we're going to talk about next. So again, this is the most proximal, the most immediate response that we have to a stressor. These things develop instantaneously, and they're the reason why we have other downstream consequences. So one response that we have physiologically when we're under stress is the activation of the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland is going to produce adrenaline, obviously, and that's going to do things like elevate our heart rate. It's going to increase our blood pressure, and ultimately it's going to increase our energy supplies. This is, again, a response that we're probably all very familiar with. We hear a loud noise somewhere in our house that's kind of far away from us. We're not sure what that loud noise is, and our heart starts thudding, right? That's the adrenal response that I'm talking about here. And the purpose of this adrenal response is to prepare us for fight or flight. Whether we choose to fight off whatever intruder is causing this noise or we choose to flee, we need a lot of energy for what's going to happen next. We need to be in a state of higher arousal so that we can expend that energy, and that's exactly what adrenaline is doing. It's giving us the energy that we need to fight or flee. Then our next is norepinephrine. This is our second stress hormone. And it's essentially a backup system to adrenaline. So what norepinephrine is going to do is elevate the amount of energy that we have available. It's also responsible, just like adrenaline, for increasing arousal so that we can address this threatening stimuli. And that might seem like a redundant response in the body, but some people, again, describe this as a backup system. It kicks in just in case your adrenal gland doesn't respond the way it should or is insufficient in some way. Then our last primary stress hormone is cortisol. And this is the hormone that's most closely associated with stress. This is released by your amygdala, which is activated when it registers a threat. And that's going to ultimately release cortisol. Cortisol is responsible for the suppression of any non-essential bodily functions during times of stress. So whereas the other two produce energy, cortisol is going to conserve energy by basically diverting all of that energy away from non-essential bodily functions toward other things that might be necessary for survival in that moment, like fighting or fleeing. Some of the responses that are suppressed when you release cortisol are things like your digestive system, your immune system response, and your reproductive system. So this is going to be really important when we think about long-term health consequences because cortisol basically takes your immune system offline. If you're experiencing the release of cortisol over long periods of time, that's going to leave you really vulnerable to getting sick. So we'll probably come back to this as we talk about these other downstream consequences. Then I also want to talk about behavioral outcomes. Obviously, within the workplace, we care a lot about behaviors and we care a lot about task performance in particular. So when we experience stress, this actually impairs a lot of cognitive processes that are associated with processing information. And we see this impairment in a lot of different ways. So stress reduces our memory capacity, it affects our reaction times, it reduces our accuracy. It also makes it more difficult to focus or pay attention, and it restricts our creativity. So kind of all around, it has these very marked cognitive effects. The primary argument for why stress has these negative consequences is because stress takes away resources. We talked about the general adaptation syndrome. The second stage involves directing our resources towards coping with the stressor. When we're doing that, we necessarily have fewer resources available for other types of cognitive processing and for attending to the actual tasks that we're assigned on the job. So it's probably not surprising that all of these cognitive impairments mean that people who experience stress also perform worse. And again, that's not always true. Eustress can be good for performance, but here we're talking about chronic stress and we're talking about distress, not eustress. Then stress also increases an employee's likelihood of engaging in counterproductive work behaviors, or CWBs, and in particular of engaging in withdrawal behaviors. We typically think of these reactions as being a result of emotions. We feel negative emotions when we experience stress, so we do bad things to alleviate those negative emotions. And then, of course, withdrawal involves being physically or psychologically absent from work, and that's probably a result of the employee trying to avoid the stressors altogether. Then we, of course, also have psychological outcomes, and one of the most pressing psychological outcomes of experiencing chronic stress is experiencing elevated mental health symptoms. So people who experience this chronic stress on the job tend to report more symptoms of anxiety, they report higher levels of depression, and more general psychological distress. Employees facing stress also report higher dissatisfaction in multiple domains. So they tend to be less satisfied with their jobs, but also tend to be less satisfied with their lives more generally. And then one of the more severe consequences of chronic stress is what we call burnout. And burnout isn't about just feeling tired. I know we often say, oh, I feel burnt out today, but it actually goes much deeper than that. And this is a diagnosable phenomenon that someone can be experiencing. So burnout is actually a state of extreme psychological strain and fatigue, and it happens when you're continually exposed to stressors that exceed your coping resources. In other words, you tend to hit a point where you can't really successfully respond to and deal with stressors any longer because you've tried to cope with them for so long that, again, you hit that level of exhaustion. Now, there are three components of burnout. The first is emotional exhaustion. This is where you feel completely emotionally drained from work. And this is a feeling of being sort of deeply psychologically fatigued, where even if you sleep for 12 hours and you do all of your favorite recovery activities, you don't feel any better, right? I like to refer to this as feeling tired in your bones, right? This is not sort of a, I didn't sleep well, I had a long day, but a chronic fatigue that you experience. Then depersonalization is the second component, and this is where you sort of become hardened by your job and you become unsympathetic and unfeeling towards others. You may have seen folks who work closely with others experience this, where over time they just seem like they don't get it, they do not care about other people, they have no empathy for what you might be going through, and they're just completely inflexible, right? That's the depersonalization phase. Then the last component is what we call low personal accomplishment. And this happens when you start to feel powerless, right? This happens when you've experienced stress for a long period of time, you've tried to do something about it, but ultimately you feel as though there's nothing you can do to change the stressful situation. You can no longer effectively deal with or cope with the problems or stressors. So you just start to feel like you're not really capable of much, right? So you start to feel this sense of low personal accomplishment where you feel like you simply just can't do this. You aren't capable of coping with the stressor. And again, burnout is something we want to take very seriously because it takes a very long time to recover from burnout. And these different phases happen in a cycle, right? We hit emotional exhaustion before depersonalization, before low personal accomplishment. So we want to look for early warning signs and try to intervene to help employees early on in this process. Then we also have some physiological and physical health outcomes. As we've sort of talked about, but not quite put formal terms to, stress activates your sympathetic nervous system, which is a good thing in the short term because this is that adaptive response that helps you engage in fight or flight and fight off whatever threatening stimuli is happening. In the short term, your sympathetic nervous system reactions can actually improve performance and decision making. But again, we're talking about chronic stress today. So we're talking about the chronic activation of your sympathetic nervous system. And when these reactions are experienced over time, they certainly don't lead to positive outcomes. And instead, we'll have excess stress hormones in our bodies that can have those damaging effects for our physical health that we've kind of alluded to here. So some of the most pronounced negative consequences for physical health are things like our coronary health or our heart health. So stress causes our blood vessels to shrink. This is called vasoconstriction, especially in the peripheral areas of blood flow. And at the same time, we're moving more blood through our bodies because we have that higher heart rate, right, that we're experiencing when your heart is pounding. So we're moving more blood through a smaller space, and that causes wear and tear on our blood vessels in and around the heart, and that increases plaque buildup in our arteries. All of that ultimately increases our risk for heart disease, and we do unfortunately see that there is this clear connection between stress, work stress in particular, and the development of heart disease. Then, as we talked about, cortisol, one of our primary stress hormones, also reduces your immune function. And that means that your defenses are down when you're exposed to stress, so you're more vulnerable to getting sick. And it's also harder for you to fight off the sickness or the illness when it happens because your immune system is essentially offline. Okay, so now we've talked about what stress is. We've talked about when it can be good, when it can be bad, defined a ton of specific stressors, and talked about the consequences for our physical health, our psychological health, and other different behavioral outcomes. So now I want to introduce some theories. And again, this is not going to be anything like the motivation chapter. We're just going to talk about a couple theories here to explain exactly what kinds of working conditions lead to stress and therefore lead to negative outcomes for employees. I think this is really critical as we think about what we as HR professionals can do to create workplaces that are free of stress. And I know that we just talked about a ton of theory last week, so we're going to take these sort of at a very high level and just kind of peek at what the theories have to say and focus in on theories that have been very well supported. So our first theory is what we call the demand control model. And this model argues that there are two primary factors that can contribute to our job stress: job demands and job control. Job demands are a product of things like our workload and the intellectual requirements of the job, whereas job control is more about autonomy and being able to use a variety of skills. Those pieces should look very familiar from the job characteristics model. So we're saying a very similar thing here. We're just applying it to the context of stress. Now, the basic premise with this model is that high demands coupled with low job control produces the highest levels of stress. If you have a really high workload and a really demanding job that affords you no autonomy in choosing your schedule or the way that you work, or it's monotonous because you're often doing the same thing over and over and over, then you're going to have the absolute worst outcomes. Now, research supports this model. As I told you, we're going to only talk about things that are well supported, and shows that employees who have high demands and low control have higher rates of illness, they have more mental health symptoms, they take more sick days, and they have higher healthcare costs for the organization as compared to employees that have lower demands and higher control. Now, again, this tells us that the best case scenario is low demand, high control. But of course, there are lots of cases, lots of different jobs where it's impossible to avoid having high demands. So what this theory would also tell us is that one thing you can do is provide people with autonomy and skill variety to offset those high demands. So maybe you can't reduce demands, but you can improve job control, and that will also mitigate stress and, of course, mitigate those downstream consequences. Then our next theory is one that we've actually already talked about. We talked about it very briefly in the individual differences lecture, but I know it's been a little bit of time since we talked about that, so I want to remind you here. And that theory is person-environment fit, or PE fit. PE fit is, again, all about how closely you match with your organization or with your job. And if you have good PE fit, then your skills, abilities, personality, knowledge, etc. are well matched with the requirements of the job and well matched to the work environment. However, if you have bad fit, then you would have some sort of mismatch, meaning the job is incompatible with your KSAOs. Maybe there's a value incongruence, but there's something where you're sort of butting heads, where you're not a great fit for your organization or for the job itself. Now, very simply, according to the theory, stress happens when there's low fit between the employee and their working environment. The working environment is usually conceptualized to be the organization, but it could also be your work group, your coworkers, your supervisor, or the job itself. So just to kind of walk through this theory, let's say that you have an extremely extroverted boss, but you're very introverted. What this theory would say is that you would experience stress because you aren't matched to your boss. There's not good fit here. So similarly, if your job requires you to do repetitive tasks, but you're someone who absolutely loves variety, you would experience stress because there's a mismatch between you and the work itself. So one thing to keep in mind with this theory is that not all employees will find the same environment or same conditions stressful, right? This theory really says that it's both dependent on the work and the person. And from this perspective, selection would be extremely important for reducing the stress of our workers, because we want to select people who are going to fit with the environment and not select people who won't. Another effective strategy would be job crafting. Job crafting is where you allow people to tailor the job to suit their needs and wants, so give them some autonomy in how they do the job and what parts of the job they invest in. So if you allow people to do some job crafting, that can also help them maximize fit. But ultimately, what this theory says is that we want congruence between the individual, their KSAOs, their values, and the organization and the job. And stress is lowest when we have high fit. Then our last theory is what we call the conservation of resources theory. This theory is also probably the closest to how we've been talking about stress so far. So ultimately what this theory argues is that people want to maintain and build resources. They're motivated to keep the resources that they have and engage in behaviors that will actually give them more resources, help them build those resources up over time. And this means that we don't want to do things that cost us resources, right? We want to conserve them rather than spend them. Now, resources are admittedly kind of poorly defined in conservation of resources theory, and this is very broad. So they can be material things, right? They can be things like financial security. It can be something like pay, promotion, or it can be something that's a little bit less tangible, like self-esteem or conserving your time and your energy. Now, according to this model, stress happens when something depletes your resources, threatens to deplete your resources, or if you don't gain resources in response to expending other resources. An example of a stressor under the conservation of resources theory could be a teammate who doesn't want to do anything. That teammate not accomplishing their task means that now you have to pick up the slack. So that costs you time and energy, and it might hurt your performance as well. So you may feel that your job security or your position in the company is in jeopardy. And it can also threaten your self-esteem because our performance might be lower because of this colleague, and that makes it hard for us to feel good about our performance level. So to kind of review here, job demands and job control says that stress occurs when you have high demands and low control. PE-FIT says that stress occurs when you and your work environment are incongruent in some way. And conservation of resources says that stress occurs when something takes away your resources. All of these models are supported, and we can use each of these to design specific interventions that HR professionals can use in selecting employees and designing jobs to, again, do things like lower demands, maximize job control, give people autonomy, select so that there's high fit, and in the case of conservation of resources, allow employees to gain resources and minimize the types of experiences that threaten them. All right, now we're going to end with my favorite part and what I think is the most practical part of this lecture, which is talking about how to manage stress. Here, I want to first recognize that there are some individual differences that relate to the experience of stress, and that can help build resilience to when we experience stressors in general. The first is locus of control, which is something that we've already talked about. So if we remember, locus of control is about whether you think the things that happen to you are within your control, if they're a product of your actions, or if they're outside of your control and a product of things like luck and chance. Internal locus of control, you think they're a product of your own actions. External locus of control, you think they're due to luck and chance. Now, what we tend to see here is that people with an internal locus of control respond to stress in more adaptive ways. And people with an external locus of control sort of believe that stressful things just happen and there's nothing they can do to change their behaviors or their responses or the environment to be less stressful. And of course, if you believe there's nothing you can do, then you aren't going to successfully cope with the stressor and be able to manage your stress or the outcomes of stress. Then the next individual difference is what we call hardiness. Hardy individuals have an internal locus of control, so they again believe that things are within their control. They also have high commitment to their goals and values, which keeps them motivated even during setbacks or even under circumstances where they're experiencing high stress. And they are also more likely to see stressors as a challenge rather than as a hindrance. So what I mean by that is they're more likely to view stressors as something they can learn and grow from rather than roadblocks. So we see that people who are high in hardiness tend to perceive less stress and respond to stress more healthfully. And then finally, we have self-esteem. That's also related to stress. Self-esteem is, of course, someone's positive sense of self-worth. And people who have higher self-esteem are generally less likely to view things as stressful and have fewer negative consequences in response to stress. Okay, so outside of individual differences, there are also actions that individual employees or organizations can take when stressors are happening to either reduce them or to reduce the consequences of them. And we're going to start off by talking about primary prevention strategies. Primary prevention strategies try to reduce or remove the stressor to begin with. So they're intervening at the primary point of intervention. If we have a stressor, the best way to change people's reactions to that stressor is just to take the stressor away altogether. Now, there are two primary prevention strategies that I want to illustrate here so you have an idea of what types of options are available. The first is job and work design, or you might see this as job and work redesign. And this is where we change the nature of the job or work to reduce stressors. One way that we tend to do this is through using the job characteristics model to redesign the job to maximize those 5 core job characteristics. Then we also have cognitive restructuring. And cognitive restructuring is really about trying to change perceptions and thought processes that lead to stress. So this isn't necessarily about removing the stressor by changing the work environment, but by removing the stressor by changing people's perceptions of how stressful the work environment is. Now, I want to be cautious with cognitive restructuring. This is a lot like CBT, where we change the way we're thinking about different things, because this can obviously be misused, right? If you sort of come in and say the problem isn't the environment, which might be objectively stressful, it's the way you're thinking about the environment, then that can be sort of counterproductive. Then we also have secondary prevention strategies, and these are strategies that try to change people's reactions to stressors. I would very much argue that we should always try for primary prevention when and where we can, but we also have to recognize that there are limitations. It's very difficult to design workplaces that are free of any kind of stressor. And there are simply times where we're not going to be able to remove the stressor directly through a primary intervention. So what we want to do is create secondary prevention strategies that equip employees to better cope with those experiences. And again, I have a couple different secondary prevention strategies here to highlight what organizations or individuals can do. Our first is what we call stress management training. And this was actually developed from CBT, from cognitive behavioral therapy, if you're familiar with that from the field of clinical psychology. And the idea here is to first identify how we respond to stressors. What's our typical response when we're under stress? Then we want to identify what of that typical response is useful and productive, and what is maybe a little more destructive than constructive. And then the idea is to learn new strategies that replace our less helpful responses to stress. So we're going to keep what's working, and we're going to replace our dysfunctional responses with more functional ones. Then oftentimes when we're undergoing the stress management training, we may also have a component wherein we can practice using these new coping techniques before applying them to the real situation, the real workplace. And we also have progressive muscle relaxation, which we're going to test out in your recitation section. And this is where we take a set of muscles, so either starting at the top of our body and moving down, or starting at our feet and moving up. And we take each set of muscles and we tighten them for 5 to 10 seconds, and then we release them. We move up to the next set of muscles, tighten those, release them. And essentially by putting ourselves in this physiological state of tension, it forces us into being a physiological state of relaxation, and that can actually help our body deal with stress and reduce the production of those stress hormones. Then, as another secondary prevention strategy, we also have social support. This is one of the most supported intervention strategies here. And what we find is that when we have high social support from our coworkers, which can either take the form of them helping us with work tasks or helping us cope emotionally, we really see that the effects of stress weaken. Then we also have mindfulness. Obviously, mindfulness is something that's gained a lot of attention, and there's a lot of conversation about mindfulness. And the data are actually pretty positive here, showing that mindfulness does help reduce stressors and help us respond to stressors more appropriately. And here, mindfulness is really a psychological process on focusing on the present. And the idea is that you want to bring your attention to your current surroundings in the current situation. And that might be something like trying to name something that you can sense with all of your different senses. So something you can smell right now, something you can feel right now, see right now, etc. And again, you're going to just sort of stop ruminating about all of the stressors, stop thinking ahead, stop thinking back, and just focus on this current moment. And then there's usually an accompanying piece where you focus on non-judgmental self-acceptance. So whatever you're feeling in response to the stressor, however you're responding to it, you accept that non-judgmentally. You extend the same care to yourself that you would give to a loved one who is experiencing the same kind of hardship. And you try to not sort of beat yourself up for being stressed out in response to whatever is happening in your life. As I said, the data are pretty positive with mindfulness, and they show that this is pretty successful in reducing stress, increasing performance, and improving well-being. Then sort of the last point that I want to make here is that research also shows the importance of recovery and engaging in what we call recovery activities. And recovery here is any sort of leisure activity that alleviates the consequences of stress, right? This is how we unwind from the workday. And I know that that's not shocking, right? That when we unwind from the workday, that's going to lower our stress or help us combat the stress that we're experiencing. But where I really want to draw our focus here is we're sort of distinguishing between different recovery activities. On one hand, we have what we call high duty activities, and on the other hand, we have what we call recovery activities. These are different ways we can spend our non-work time. High duty activities are things like finishing up any sort of work, so engaging in job-related activities during non-work time, wrapping up emails, finishing a project, whatever. Then we also have things that require energy expenditure, so things like household and childcare. If we're running errands, we're doing laundry, we're cleaning our home, we're not resting, we're not recovering, we are still expending lots of energy. These types of activities, when we spend our free time in this way, do not help us recover from stress and in fact can exacerbate the problem. Then we have what we consider to be true recovery activities, and those are low effort activities, social activities, and physical activities. Low effort activities are things where we do basically nothing. We do not expend any energy. So if you come home from work, you come home from school, and you just basically melt into your couch and binge watch your favorite show, that's a low effort activity. Social activities are things like going out with your friends. Physical activities are things like walking your dog, going to the gym, etc. Now, these are all considered recovery, but they're not created equal. Physical activities and social activities are helpful for recovering from stress, but they still require some level of energy expenditure. So they're not the best case scenario when we're in really high stress situations. And what we find is that low effort activities help us recover the absolute most. I would encourage you, if you're experiencing high stress and you feel like you're not recovering, to kind of map out your time, right? So keep track of how you're spending your leisure time. If you're spending that time doing these high expenditure activities, like high duty activities, try to invest more in recovery activities. And if you're doing recovery activities, but it's mostly social and physical, try to build in more of the low effort activities. This is where we really recover, really recuperate those lost resources. And then finally, I want to just leave you with a TED Talk. This is absolutely optional. You are not going to be tested on it, but I think it's a really fantastic talk that's all about arousal reappraisal, which is another way that we can think about stress and stress reduction. And it's something that seems to be very effective. So arousal reappraisal is essentially reframing the way we see all of that physiological arousal, where our palms are sweaty and our heart is racing. And instead of seeing it as something negative, something that's hurting us, we reappraise it to ourselves as something that is mobilizing your body to be good at performance. And when we do this, when we shift our view of that physiological reaction to helping us perform rather than hurting us, it actually reduces the consequences of stress pretty significantly. So I think it's a great watch. I encourage you to watch it, but again, it's not required. All right, that's all I have for you this week. We only have 1 week left before your next exam, and that week will cover learning and decision making.